Hey everyone, it's Gene Calderon here doing a apologetics ministry, just reaching out to you and sharing a little bit of what we do as far as science, history, philosophy, theology, and moral and cultural issues. And this month being February, we're kind of going through a short series on Black history, specifically Black history here in America. And what we did last time was we talked about a man named Frederick Douglass, and he was an abolitionist, someone who was looking to abolish slavery. Now, he had grown up a slave. He had freed himself by escaping and really kind of led an anti-slavery movement and came under the wing of an abolitionist who was able to teach him and share with him much of what the Constitution says. However, as we discovered a little bit last time, was when he read the Constitution for himself, he started to have a little bit of change in his thinking. In fact, he came to the conclusion that the Constitution really was an anti-slavery document. And as we mentioned in his book that he himself wrote, he basically said at the end of a certain paragraph, it says, "And the Constitution of the United States not only contains no guarantees in favor of slavery, it is in its letter and spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence as the supreme law of the land." And then he goes on to write, "Here was a radical change in my opinions." So when we read that, we looked at this, okay, well, if the Constitution is not a pro-slavery document, what do we make of the 3/5 clause that is usually presented as proof that the Constitution is a slavery document? Well, let's look back at what Black Americans and abolitionists came to understand about the 3/5 clause, because he came to the conclusion that this clause only dealt with representation, not the worth of any one person. In fact, the Constitution, when we look at it, it establishes that for every 30,000 inhabitants a state has, you are allowed one representative for Congress. And the southern states, they saw this as an opportunity or a reason to increase slavery because they thought, hey, if we can have more slaves that count as inhabitants, we could almost double our pro-slavery representatives in Congress. Now, of course, the northern states, they were completely against that idea. After all, slave owners, they considered their slaves property first and a person second. And if they were going to use that kind of language about their slaves, then they would have to admit that they are using property to increase their power of their states in the institution of slavery as well. Now, the northern states, they were completely fine with counting free Black Americans, but not the use of slaves in the southern states who would not be given the freedom to be able to contribute to their communities and actually were just being used by their slave owners in order to gain an influence in Congress. So the northern states understood that the fewer representatives that the South had, the less power they would have to legislate, and the sooner they can get rid of slavery. Several of the country founders like James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry began to use the slavery's own arguments against them, because those two founders argued that if the South is going to count property to get more representation in Congress, then the North would use its property, things like its homes, its tools, its livestock, all to get more anti-slavery representatives in Congress. Now, of course, the South objected to that idea just as strongly as the North objected to the South's use of slaves. So the final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, or 3/5, could be counted towards representation. So in other words, it would take 50,000 slaves instead of 30,000 to gain new representation. And this would guarantee that a largely populated slave state would not become too powerful, making slavery permanent in the United States. And this was the purpose of the 3/5 clause that Frederick Douglass discovered. It had nothing to do with the worth of the individual. In fact, many Blacks in the North and some in the South who were given free, full rights citizenship because of their freedom, including things like the right to vote. The 3/5 clause only had to deal with the representation in Congress, and it was geared towards anti-slavery, limiting the number of pro-slavery representation in Congress. And this is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many of us who have probably never read the Constitution, much less try to even study it, could say that the Constitution as a whole was anti-slavery. In 1789, Congress expanded its fight to end slavery by passing what's known as the Northwest Ordinance. This law said that slavery was not allowed in any of the developing federal territories at that time. And it was because of that law, states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, they were not slave states when they became part of the Union. They were considered free states. On a federal level, progress was being made to end slavery and to give full civil rights to Black Americans. And again, this is what we understand from the Constitution about the 3/5 clause that was discovered and well explained by Frederick Douglass, a Black American hero who was really dealing with the issues at the time and taking the time to understand them and fight for those right causes. So hats off to Frederick Douglass. He's a great example of someone who takes the time to study and to be able to look at and make reasonable arguments. Again, if you read his book, brilliantly written, very, very interesting to be able to see how he was willing to keep an open mind and follow the facts where they lead. Let's take that into consideration. Let's follow that kind of example, the kind of example that Frederick Douglass himself gave for us and wrote down in his own writings for us to be able to follow. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you are excited about going over more information like this. If you're interested, again, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and all these different websites that I'll be sharing. If you'd like to contribute or help me do what I do on college campuses or youth groups or other churches or just speaking events in general around this area, there's a tab there where you can make a donation. You can be a one-time giver. You can be a monthly supporter of me, Gene Calderon, specifically tied with Ratio Christi here in Northwest Indiana, but I am overseeing the entire state. But if there's any way that we can help you, feel free to call, talk to us, message me. We're always open to be able to serve in any way possible. And if you have something that you'd like to hear or you'd like to discuss, share it here. Put it in the comments. As long as it's clean, I'd let any kind of opinion and decisions go on back and forth. That is great. This is exactly what we saw an example of, someone who was willing to argue back and forth to be able to come to their own reasonable conclusions based on the facts that they were presented. So hope you enjoyed this. Thank you guys for watching. God bless.